Story number one. I had gone on a solo camping trip in Montana last fall. It was something I'd always wanted to do. Just pack up my tent, some gear, and disappear into the wilderness for a weekend. But what happened on that trip still makes my stomach twist every time I think about it. I started hiking early in the morning, planning to set up camp somewhere deep in the forest before sunset. By the time it started getting dark, I was exhausted but still hadn't found a suitable clearing for my tent. I told myself I'd settle for the next decent spot I found. It was near midnight and I was still moving, the forest around me silent and claustrophobic, even though the moon was up. Suddenly, I felt a sharp drop in temperature, like someone had opened the door of a massive freezer right next to me. 1 second I was just tired. The next I could see my breath fogging up in front of my face. The wind picked up out of nowhere, not like a passing breeze, but like a steady, cold current wrapping around my body. The hairs on the back of my neck rose. That's when I saw it. Through a gap between the trees, there was a structure in the distance. At first, I thought I was imagining it, because it made no sense for a building to be there. As I got closer, I realized it was an old church, wooden, small, with its roof half collapsed and the steeple leaning slightly to one side. It looked like something that should have been abandoned a century ago. The boards were weathered, some completely missing, but the faint shape of a cross was still visible above the door. There was no path leading to it, no sign that anyone had been around in a long time. Just trees, silence, and this church sitting in the middle of nowhere like it had grown out of the ground. I should have turned around. I pushed the door open. It groaned like it hadn't moved in years. The interior smelled like damp wood and something metallic, almost like rust. My flashlight beam swept across the dusty pews, broken windows, and scattered debris. Then it caught something on the floor near what must have been the altar. There was a circular motif carved directly into the wooden floorboards. The carving was crude but deliberate. Concentric circles with strange symbols I didn't recognize etched between them. At the center, there was a raised podium-like structure. What made me freeze wasn't the motif itself, but the dark, wet stains smeared on it. It was fresh. Even in the dim light, I could tell it wasn't old dried paint or something. It looked like blood. There was too much of it for me to brush it off as some animal accident. I felt this instinctive jolt of unease, like I had walked in on something I wasn't supposed to see, but my brain kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe hunters, a prank, teen vandalism, anything but what it looked like. I decided to check the basement, mostly because I wanted to make sure no one else was down there before I rested. The basement itself was almost empty, just dirt floor, a couple of broken chairs, and one small window that was boarded up from the outside. Then I heard it. Above me, someone was running. Quick, uneven footsteps pounding across the floorboards. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal scurrying. It sounded distinctly human. My pulse spiked. I froze mid-step on the staircase, staring up at the ceiling as the footsteps crossed from one end of the building to the other. I stayed like that for what felt like a full minute, my breath shallow. Then silence. When I finally went back upstairs, the first thing I noticed was that the podium area looked different. The blood was gone, completely. The wood was dry, but at the center of the circular motif, there was now a body. It was a man. At least it looked like one. Pale, motionless, eyes half open. His clothes were torn and dirty, like he'd been lying there for days. But there was no smell of decay. His chest didn't rise or fall. I stood there frozen. My first instinct was to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. The air in the room shifted again, colder, denser, like I'd stepped into a vacuum. And then I felt it. Something tightened around my neck. It wasn't hands, it wasn't visible. It was like an invisible rope had looped itself around me and was yanking backward. Hard. I stumbled, clawing at my throat, but there was nothing to grab. My flashlight fell and clattered across the floor, spinning so that its beam cut through the room in wild arcs. I could feel my airway closing, my vision narrowing. My body started jerking uncontrollably as I flapped my hands in panic. There was no one behind me, no wires, nothing I could see, just that crushing pressure, relentless, as if something was determined to choke the life out of me. My ears started ringing, the room tilted, and then everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on my back on cold, damp ground. Trees surrounded me on all sides. No church, no structure, just forest. My pack was beside me, but my flashlight was gone. The air was still freezing, but the wind had died down. For a few seconds, I wondered if I'd hallucinated the whole thing. Maybe I'd passed out from exhaustion and dreamed it. But my throat hurt, badly. When I touched it, it was tender, and the skin felt raw, like I'd been wearing a rope that had been pulled tight. I staggered around in the dark for a while, trying to find the church again, but there was nothing, just endless trees and darkness. Eventually, I gave up and set up my tent right there. I didn't sleep much. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves felt amplified, like the forest was holding its breath around me. At one point, I swore I heard faint footsteps circling my tent, slow and deliberate, but when I peeked out with my phone flashlight, there was nothing. When dawn finally came, the woods looked normal again, birds chirping, soft light filtering through the trees. My neck still ached. I packed up and left as fast as I could. I've told myself maybe I stumbled upon some hunter's shed that I misinterpreted in the dark. Maybe the body was a mannequin or my brain playing tricks in low light. Maybe the choking was a panic attack, or I got caught in some kind of branch or vine while blacking out. But I've gone through that forest again on satellite view. There's no church anywhere near where my GPS tracker shows I was that night. Not even ruins, just trees. And sometimes when it's quiet at night, I swear I can still feel that sudden drop in temperature, like a door to a freezer has just opened behind me. Story number 2, I used to work in low-income home weatherization up in Alaska. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills. My job was to inspect old houses, figure out how to keep the heat from leaking out, and make the place more energy efficient. I'd been doing it for years, so not much surprised me anymore. I'd crawled through rat-infested crawl spaces, squeezed into damp basements, and dealt with more mold than I care to remember. But this one job stuck with me. Not because of what I saw exactly, but because of the way it made me feel. And the fact that, officially, it never existed. The house was perched near the top of a small mountain. It wasn't accessible by any regular road, so I had to park at the base and hike up with my inspection gear. It took me almost 45 minutes, with the cold air biting at my cheeks and my breath puffing out like smoke. The path wasn't well maintained either, just a narrow dirt track winding through pines, snow still packed down in patches, even though it was late spring. After a cold, grueling 45-minute hike, the house came into view. 2 stories, weathered black wood, all wrong against the pale sky. Windows intact, but the structure looking like it had partially sunk. The snow was undisturbed, only a few animal tracks around the porch. As I climbed the steps, a stench hit me. Not just death, but rot mixed with iron, sharper than any dead animal in a crawl space. I gagged, muffled my nose with my scarf, but it barely helped. The door opened after a long moment. The owner was a man in his late 60s, thin to the point of looking brittle, with sunken eyes that seemed too dark against his pale skin. He moved slowly, like someone who hadn't had company in a long time. He didn't say much, just gestured for me to come in. I did, mostly because turning back after the hike felt ridiculous. The interior of the house was dim, even though it was midday. Thick curtains blocked most of the light, and the lamps were weak, yellowish things that cast more shadow than illumination. The smell inside was worse, thicker, like it was coming from somewhere deep in the house. The air was cold, unnaturally so, as if the place didn't hold warmth at all. While I noted down details for the insulation inspection, I did a quick visual sweep. 3 rooms branched off from the hallway, 2 bedrooms and one that seemed like a study. As I glanced toward the last room, something moved. A woman's face peeked out for a split second. Pale skin, long hair, wide eyes locked straight on me. She didn't blink. She just stared. It was long enough that I was sure I saw her, not just a trick of light. When I looked back, the door was fully shut. Later, when I casually asked the man if anyone else was home, he flatly said he lived alone and that his wife had died 3 years ago. I wanted to laugh it off, maybe assume I'd seen a reflection or a picture. But the door had moved, and that face, it was too real. I decided to start the inspection with the basement, since that's where most of the heat loss usually happens. That's when he walked into the kitchen and without a word, started pushing the refrigerator aside. Underneath was a flap of old carpet, and beneath that, a hidden door to the basement. My stomach tightened, but it was my job, and refusing to check wasn't really an option. So I pulled out my flashlight and aimed it down the stairwell. The beam landed on a dead cat at the bottom of the stairs, reduced mostly to a skeleton with scraps of fur still clinging to the bones. Not unusual, honestly. Animals get stuck in basements all the time. But as I moved a few steps down, the beam caught more bones. Two smaller skeletons, side by side, their proportions oddly human. The skull shapes weren't exactly animal. I paused, heart thudding in my ears, and forced myself to look closer. All around the basement floor, scattered in no particular order, were skeletons. Some were intact, others degraded to unrecognizable fragments, at least 10 at a glance. The air down there was icy and still, and the smell hit me like a solid wall. It was stronger near the ground, damp and metallic, like blood soaked into wood a long time ago. My brain scrambled for logical explanations. Maybe it was some kind of animal hoarding. Maybe someone dumped old remains here decades ago. Maybe I was misidentifying everything in my nerves. But then I noticed the man standing at the top of the stairs, perfectly still, one hand on the door. He wasn't watching me with curiosity. He was just waiting, quietly. I realized how hidden this basement was, how isolated the house was, how no one knew I was here. I was 4 steps away from the door closing fully, no partner on the job with me, surrounded by skeletons. A deep instinctual alarm went off in my head like a siren. I turned, forced a calm walk back up the stairs. He was smiling now, wide, almost childlike, but completely out of place. It was the kind of smile that didn't match anything happening. When I reached for the front door, the knob didn't turn. It felt jammed, like someone had locked it from outside, but there was no visible lock. I turned back to ask, but the hallway was empty. He wasn't there anymore. For a few seconds, I stood completely still, listening. There was no sound of footsteps, no voice, nothing. Just that cold air pressing in on me. Eventually, after fumbling, the knob gave way and the door opened like nothing had been wrong. I didn't look back. I grabbed my gear and practically speed walked down that mountain path. But as I went, I heard the crunch of footsteps behind me, sometimes off to the side, sometimes matching mine exactly. I told myself it was echoes, maybe a fox, maybe wind shaking the trees, but the sound was so deliberate, steady, and close that my skin crawled. When I got back to the office and reported the inspection, my supervisor stared at me blankly. According to the schedule, I hadn't been assigned to any house that day. There was no record of that address, no work order, nothing. I pulled up the company logs myself, and there was nothing there. I even drove back a week later, thinking maybe I took the wrong trail. But no matter how far I hiked, I never found the same path again. It's been years since that day. Sometimes I wonder if I mixed up locations or got pranked somehow. Other times, late at night, I think about that woman's face, those bones in the dark, and the way the man smiled at me like I'd stepped exactly where he wanted. I try to rationalize it, I really do, but some things never quite settle. Story number 3. I don't usually post online, but what happened during that camping trip last fall still keeps me up at night. It's not something I can explain neatly, and honestly, part of me wonders if my brain just snapped under stress. But then there's the knife. That damn knife keeps showing up. Jack, my cousin, was the one who pushed for the trip. He was the kind of person who liked to make everything extreme. If there were a regular trail, he'd find the hardest one. If there were a 2-day camp, he'd want 4. When he suggested camping on a remote mountain trail in late fall, I said yes more out of pressure than excitement. The first strange thing happened the moment we reached the base. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs, and suddenly felt a burst of warm breath against my ear. Not just a breeze, it was wet, deliberate, like someone had leaned in close and exhaled directly into it. I spun around with my fist half raised, expecting Jack to be messing with me. But he was a few feet away, chatting with one of the rangers about permits. There wasn't anyone else nearby. The trees were bare, the air crisp and cold. It wasn't windy. I remember rubbing the side of my ear instinctively. It actually felt damp. I pushed the thought away and focused on setting up camp as the sun dipped. By the time we finished, the forest around us was swallowed by darkness. The bonfire crackled in front of our tent, and the cold bit at our fingers whenever we moved too far from the flames. The quiet was thick, the kind that amplifies every small sound. The occasional rustle of leaves or distant branch crack made my nerves twitch. That's when she came. Out of nowhere, a woman stumbled out of the tree line, covered in blood. It wasn't just a smear, it was streaked down her arms, her clothes torn, hair tangled. She was screaming, a raw, guttural sound that cut straight through the silence. Jack and I froze for a second, our brains struggling to catch up. Then we rushed to her. Her story tumbled out in fragments. Her boyfriend had attacked her and was chasing her through the woods. She begged for help. We took her into the tent, gave her a blanket, and tried to make her comfortable. Jack and I agreed to keep watch through the night. At some point, Jack went off into the woods to relieve himself. I was left sitting outside by the dying fire, staring at the tent flap, feeling like something was pressing down on the air around me. That's when I heard it, a slow, dragging scratch from behind the tent. It wasn't the quick scrabbling of an animal. It was long, deliberate, like metal dragging against bark. I circled around, flashlight in hand. There was nothing. When I peeked back inside the tent, my stomach dropped. She was gone. No footprints, no trail, nothing. Just an empty blanket and a faint metallic smell in the air. I called out for Jack, and he came back a moment later. That's when I noticed something wrong. His movements were jerky, almost like he was forcing his limbs to work. His head tilted slightly when he walked. His voice, when he asked what happened, sounded deeper, rougher, like someone mimicking his tone, but not quite getting it right. He didn't seem fully aware of it either. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was just cold or tired. But then, a minute later, Jack came walking down the trail from the opposite direction. Normal Jack. I stood frozen. Two Jacks. One with that unnatural stiffness, one looking completely confused to see my pale face. My brain blanked. The mechanical Jack stepped toward me. In a blink, there was a knife in his hand. It was long, old-looking, with a blackened handle. He lunged. I stumbled back, barely dodging. He drove the knife into the tree trunk behind me with such force that it stuck halfway in. And then, he was gone. No footsteps, no running, just gone. The only sound was my breathing and the faint crackle of the fire. The real Jack looked at me like I'd lost my mind. He swore he hadn't left to go anywhere other than to pee. I didn't tell him what I saw. I couldn't. I wasn't even sure myself. We spent the rest of the night in tense silence, both of us on edge. The next day, we searched for the woman. No trace, no blood, no footprints. It was like she'd been a hallucination. We cut the trip short and headed home. A few weeks later, the news reported that a woman's body had been found not far from the mountain. The same woman. She'd been dead for days before our camping trip. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. A few nights after we got back, I woke up in the middle of the night with a strange feeling, like I wasn't alone in the room. I turned on the lamp and nearly screamed. That same knife was lodged upright in the floorboards beside my bed, the tip angled toward my face. It hadn't been there when I went to sleep. My door was locked from the inside. I threw it away the next morning, but a week later, it was in my closet, propped against the wall, then under my sink. Then once I opened my car's glove compartment, and there it was, perfectly balanced across the papers. Each time I threw it out farther, once even into a lake. Each time it came back, no explanation. I started noticing small things too. A warm breath against my ear in crowded places. A brief reflection in the bathroom mirror that didn't quite match my movements. Shadows in the corner of my vision that seemed to stiffly jerk like that version of Jack. It never lasted long enough for proof. Jack and I don't talk about it. We both saw that woman on the news. We both know something happened on that mountain, even if neither of us can explain it. Sometimes I tell myself the woman was just a trauma-induced hallucination, that my brain was tricking me under stress, that maybe the other Jack was some kind of sleep-deprived misperception in the dark. As for the knife, Maybe someone's playing an elaborate prank. But sometimes late at night, I feel it again. That warm, damp breath against my ear. I turn around and nothing's there. And every morning, no matter how many times I throw it away, that knife is somewhere new. I keep telling myself there has to be a rational explanation. There has to be. Right. Story number 4. I've never been able to make complete sense of what happened during that hiking trip in Transylvania, and it's been more than 3 decades. The whole thing took place in the early 90s, before cell phones, GPS, or even proper maps that a bunch of high school kids could rely on. We were just a group of 6 friends from school on a summer break, deciding it would be fun to go on a long mountain hike for a few days. The Carpathians were beautiful but wild, and that part of Transylvania wasn't exactly filled with tourists back then. The hike started out well. The air was crisp, and there was that deep forest smell, pine, wet earth, and a faint hint of something metallic that I always associate with mountain streams. We trekked for about 12 to 14 kilometers uphill that day, the forest getting denser the higher we went. The paths were old, sometimes vanishing into overgrowth, and we had to rely on rough sketches we'd copied from a local map. We were tired but in good spirits. Then in the middle of nowhere, literally miles from any marked road, we saw a house. It sat in a small clearing like it had been dropped there centuries ago and forgotten. A tilted wooden fence surrounded a barn, and there were a few cows and some chickens wandering around. Thin smoke curled out of a chimney, and for a moment, we were just shocked. None of us had expected to find people living up there. The house looked old but lived in. Patchy wooden walls, a sagging roof, but fresh footprints in the mud around it. As we approached slowly, we saw a man and 5 or 6 women outside. The women stood close together but at a distance from us, while the man walked toward us. He was tall but slightly hunched, wearing clothes that looked handmade. Thick wool, faded colors, nothing modern about them. His expression was blank but intense, like someone watching you closely but not entirely understanding you. He tried to speak to us, but his Romanian was broken, almost archaic. It wasn't the regular rural dialect we'd heard in villages. He asked something about where we came from, and when we tried to explain, there was this confused, childlike look on his face. At one point, he asked who the president was, and it sounded like a genuine question, as if he hadn't heard news in years. He gestured toward the barn, then toward us, and we eventually figured out he was offering us fresh milk. One of my friends politely refused, but I remember the way the women stared at us while he spoke, unblinking still. Their faces had this strange flatness to them, as if they weren't used to showing emotion. Their clothes were simple dresses, and their hair was tied back the same way, almost uniform. They didn't come near us, not even when he beckoned them. What really unsettled me was the quiet. Apart from the cows shifting and the occasional chicken clucking, there was no sound. No wind in the trees, no birds, nothing. And the air had that weird cold heaviness, like when you walk into a room that's been shut for a long time. Even though the sun was still up, shadows from the tall trees around the clearing made everything feel dim. As we stood there trying to communicate, I couldn't shake the feeling that there were more people inside the house. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement through a cracked shutter, a shape, maybe a face pulling away when I looked. My friends noticed it too. One of them kept looking toward the tree line, whispering that we should leave before it got dark. The man's eyes followed every movement we made, not aggressively, but like he was assessing something. Then came this odd moment. One of the women lifted her hand slowly and pointed at our hiking boots, whispering something to the others. They all started murmuring among themselves, eyes fixed on our clothes and bags like we were aliens. It wasn't hostile, but it was unnerving, like they hadn't seen outsiders in a very, very long time. We made excuses about needing to continue before nightfall. The man gave a curt nod but didn't move aside immediately. For a few seconds, there was this strange tension. No threats, no words, but something in the air that made every instinct scream to leave. Finally, he stepped back. We walked calmly for a while, keeping our pace steady until we were sure we were out of their sight. Then we bolted downhill like our lives depended on it. It should have ended there, but the weirdness followed us. We walked for about 3 more hours before deciding to set up camp in a clearing by a stream. It was getting dark, and none of us had the energy to keep going. We built a small fire and agreed to take turns keeping watch. At around midnight during my shift, I thought I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, coming from the forest behind us. I convinced myself it was a deer or some animal, but the sound was too steady. It would stop when I held my breath, then resume when I exhaled. I woke another friend quietly, but by the time he sat up, the noise had stopped completely. The next morning, we found something strange near the stream. There were muddy footprints, barefoot, human-sized, just a few meters from where our tents were. They weren't ours. All of us had boots, and the shape was clear in the wet soil. They led toward the forest and then vanished abruptly, like whoever made them had stepped into nothing. We packed up quickly. None of us talked much. As we descended, the forest seemed louder again. Birds chirping, wind moving through the leaves. It felt almost too normal, as if the silence from the previous day hadn't happened. When we reached a small village at the base of the mountains, we told a few locals about the house and the mountain people. They laughed it off. According to them, nobody lived that far up anymore. The last families had moved down decades ago. One old man even swore the house we described had burned down in the 70s. We insisted we saw it. Cows, chickens, smoke, people. But they just shook their heads. They said it was probably a hallucination from fatigue, or that we'd wandered off track and confused a hunting lodge with a house. Years later, I tried to look up any isolated communities or cults that might have existed in that region. There were vague mentions of self-sustaining families who'd gone off the grid during the communist era, but nothing concrete. Some claimed there were hermits in the mountains. Others said hikers sometimes hallucinate under stress and low oxygen. Rational explanations maybe, but there are details that stick with me. The cold, heavy air around that house, the sound of footsteps circling our camp, those barefoot prints in the mud, and the look on that man's face, like he was both curious and waiting for something. I've hiked in many places since then. I've camped alone, but I've never felt anything quite like that day in the Transylvanian mountains. Sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet, I catch myself thinking about that house, and I wonder if anyone else ever stumbled on it after us, or if, like the villagers said, it never existed at all. Story number 5. I think something in Missouri didn't want me on that trail. I've been on solo camping trips plenty of times. I like the quiet, the feeling of being completely cut off from the usual noise. But this trip in rural Missouri was the first time I genuinely questioned whether I'd made a terrible mistake. The trail wasn't marked on most maps. A friend of a friend had told me about it. A single-lane dirt path deep in the woods that supposedly led to an old observation point. There were no exits, no branches, just a straight trail between dense, almost suffocating forest on both sides. The kind where the trees grow so close together that even daylight struggles to filter through. I started late in the afternoon, figuring I'd set up camp near the end and hike back the next morning. About 30 minutes in, I noticed how still everything was. The usual forest sounds, chirping, rustling, the occasional insect buzz, were absent. Even my footsteps on the dirt sounded unusually loud. At one point, I caught something in the corner of my eye. When I turned my head, I froze. Between two trees, there were a pair of glowing, bright blue eyes. They weren't like animal eyes catching light. They were glowing. Two floating points in the shadows, unblinking. They held my gaze for maybe 2 seconds before vanishing as suddenly as they appeared. I laughed nervously, chalking it up to the way sunlight might have hit something reflective. Still, it bothered me enough that I quickened my pace. An hour later, the unease turned into real confusion. I recognized a tree I'd passed earlier, a big, twisted oak with a lightning scar down the middle. At first, I thought I'd made a wrong turn, but there was nowhere to turn. It was a single, straight dirt path. I shrugged it off and walked for another hour, this time paying close attention to every landmark. When I reached the same tree again, my stomach dropped. I knew for a fact I hadn't turned around. My footprints were still in the soft dirt, pointing forward, and yet somehow I was back at the same spot. The air started to feel heavier after that. The forest seemed darker, though the sun hadn't fully set yet. Every step made the silence louder, like it was pressing in on me. Then out of nowhere, a crow fell from the sky and landed directly in front of me with a dull thud. Its wings splayed awkwardly. It didn't twitch. Its eyes were wide open, as if it had died mid-flight from sheer terror. Instinctively, I looked up, expecting to see a flock, or at least some movement. But the sky was empty, perfectly clear, not a single bird in sight. I hurried forward, my backpack suddenly feeling a lot heavier. That's when I heard it, a voice sharp and clear, cutting through the silence. It told me to go back. Just those words. No echo, no distortion. It sounded like someone was standing right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. No footprints, no rustling leaves. Just me, the dead crow, and the suffocating stillness. I called out. Nothing replied. The forest seemed to hold its breath. I can't explain why, but that voice didn't sound human. Not in a monster movie way, but in a wrong frequency way, like it was coming from somewhere too close to be real. I don't remember deciding to move forward. I just did. It felt like going back wasn't an option. The deeper I went, the stranger everything became. The temperature dropped, and I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. There were moments when I could swear I heard footsteps matching my pace just a few feet to my left, hidden behind the tree line. Every time I stopped, they stopped too. The forest didn't just feel empty. It felt like it was watching. Finally, after what felt like hours, the trail opened up into a small clearing. At first, I was relieved. I thought I'd reached the end. But the relief curdled the second I saw what was waiting. In the center of the clearing, there were deer corpses arranged in a perfect circle. At least a dozen of them. Each one lay on its side, eyes wide open in the same shocked expression as the crow. Their bodies were stiff, like they'd all died simultaneously. The smell hit me a second later. Thick, metallic, and rotten, though their bodies didn't look decomposed yet. Beneath each deer, etched crudely into the dirt, was a symbol. I didn't recognize it fully, but I'd seen something similar once in a book about occult rituals. It was some kind of incantation mark. The arrangement was too deliberate to be random. The air in the clearing felt different, thicker. My chest tightened, and I started to feel lightheaded. The edges of my vision blurred slightly, like I was standing in a pocket of air that didn't belong to the rest of the world. That's when I realized I couldn't move. My legs felt numb, like they weren't mine anymore. My body was frozen in place, staring at the circle of deer. The voice came again. Same sharpness, same clarity. This time, it wasn't warning me. It was laughing. A low, distorted, joyless laugh that echoed in my skull rather than my ears. It said they'd warned me. The sound wrapped around me like cold hands. I don't know how long I stood there. It might have been seconds or minutes. Eventually, feeling returned to my legs like a sudden jolt, and I ran. I didn't think. I didn't look back. I just ran. Somehow, I reached my car just as the last of the daylight vanished. My watch said I'd been gone for barely 4 hours, but it felt like days. When I looked back toward the trail, it was just a dark gap between trees, as if nothing unusual had ever happened. I drove until I hit the nearest town. I sat in a gas station parking lot for almost an hour, trying to make sense of it. The rational part of me keeps trying to piece it together. Maybe I got turned around somehow, looping without realizing it. Maybe the blue eyes were an animal's reflection in some weird lighting. The crow could have had a heart attack mid-flight. The voice could have been some echo, or even my mind playing tricks after hours of silence. The deer circle. Maybe someone else had been there earlier, hunters or cultists, and I just stumbled upon it. But none of that explains the feeling of being trapped. None of it explains the numbness in my legs or the voice that seemed to bypass my ears entirely. I haven't told many people about it because it sounds crazy, but sometimes late at night, I think about those blue eyes in the trees. I think about that perfect circle of dead deer and the laugh. The worst part? A few days later, I tried to find the trail again online. I couldn't. The directions my friend gave me led to a dead end. The path I had hiked on was demolished years ago due to a forest fire eruption. I still have no idea where I went for hike. I haven't gone camping alone since. Story number 6. This happened about a year ago, but it's still one of those memories that plays back in my head at night like a movie I can't pause. I've told a couple of people, but I usually stop halfway through because even I start to doubt what I saw. But every time I think about it, my skin crawls the same way it did that day. My buddy was throwing a birthday party for his daughter at this big public park near where we grew up. It's a nice place. Huge grassy fields, a playground, some picnic areas, and then a dense chunk of woods off to one side. When we were kids, those woods felt endless. There used to be this old stone fort tucked deep inside, probably some kind of abandoned utility structure, but we used to call it a fort and treat it like some mythical hideout. The park is surrounded by highways and suburban roads now. It's not isolated, but once you step into those woods, the traffic sounds fade into this weird muffled hum, like someone turned down the volume of the world. After the cake and all the usual party stuff, a few of us decided to take a quick walk to see if the fort was still there. It was supposed to be just a nostalgic detour before heading back. My friend led the way, his brother followed, and I trailed behind. There were 4 of us in total. The trail started out clear, with sunlight filtering through the trees. But as we went deeper, the air shifted. It got cooler, damper, the kind of cold that doesn't match the actual temperature outside. The ground was soft, almost spongy in some places, and smelled strongly of wet leaves and mud. About 10 minutes in, my friend froze. He didn't say anything at first, just stopped mid-step and slowly pointed ahead. I followed his finger, and that's when I saw her. She was maybe 40 or 50 feet ahead, standing between 2 trees. At least that's what I thought at first. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized her feet weren't touching the ground. She was just hanging there in the air, about a foot above the forest floor. Her body was perfectly still, no swaying, no shifting. The way her head tilted slightly down made it look like she was staring straight at us, even though I couldn't make out her face clearly. Her hair was long and dark, hanging straight down like wet strings. She wore something pale, maybe a dress or a nightgown. It was hard to tell in the dim light filtering through the canopy. For a second, I genuinely thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I blinked, squinted, even rubbed my eyes quickly. But she didn't disappear. The strangest part wasn't just that she was floating, it was how silent everything had become. The birds, the distant traffic, the rustling of leaves, all gone. It was like someone hit mute on the entire forest. We all stood there, not moving, for what felt like forever. In reality, it was probably 30 seconds. Then without any sound, she slowly drifted sideways behind a tree. It wasn't walking. It was like watching something on a string being pulled out of sight. Nobody said anything. We just turned around at the same time and started walking back. Not running, but that stiff, urgent pace where every step feels too loud. I wish that was the end of it. On the walk back, I started feeling weird. Not like I was being watched. Worse, like something was just a few steps behind me, perfectly matching my speed, but not making a sound. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing. Just trees and shadows. When we finally got out of the woods, the normal park sounds hit me all at once. Kids laughing, cars on the road, people talking. It was almost disorienting, like stepping out of a vacuum. We didn't bring it up during the party. Everyone went back to pretending nothing happened. But later that night, when I was home alone, I noticed something strange. My socks and the bottom of my jeans were covered in this fine grayish-black dust. It wasn't mud or dirt. It looked almost like ash. I hadn't seen any fires out there, and none of the others had it on their clothes. For the next week, little things started happening. When I tried to sleep, I'd hear faint footsteps outside my bedroom window. Not scurrying, not random animal noises, just slow, deliberate steps. Every time I checked, the yard would be empty. One night, I woke up to my bedroom light flickering like it was on a dimmer switch. It wasn't. The bulb was steady when I got up to check it, but as soon as I lay down again, the light started that slow, uneven pulsing. The worst incident happened about a week later. I was walking to my car early in the morning when I saw wet footprints on the concrete driveway. Bare human footprints. They started near the side of my house and stopped right by my car door. The ground had been dry all night. I told myself maybe a neighbor's kid ran through with wet feet or something, but it didn't really make sense. There were no prints leading away. I tried to rationalize what we saw in the woods too. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion caused by light shafts. Maybe someone hung a white sheet in the trees. Maybe the ground dipped in a weird way, making it look like she was floating. But deep down, none of those explanations fit the way she moved, or didn't move. Months passed and the weird occurrences died down. Life went back to normal mostly. I didn't talk about it much because I didn't want to be the guy who claimed to see ghosts in broad daylight. But last week, something brought it all back. I was scrolling through a local community group online when someone posted about those woods being partially cleared for new housing development. In the photo, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the background between the tree line, there was a pale shape, blurry, almost transparent. Could have been a trick of light, sure, a glare, a lens issue. But the posture, the slight downward tilt of the head, it looked exactly like her. I stared at that photo for a long time. Then I closed my laptop and turned off every light in my house because, for some reason, sitting in the dark felt safer than acknowledging that shape again. I still don't know what we saw that day. Maybe it was some elaborate prank, or my brain misfiring in the dim forest light, or maybe some things linger in places where they shouldn't. I haven't gone back to those woods since, but every so often, especially on cold, damp nights when the wind outside dies down completely, I swear I can feel that same silence pressing against the walls. Like the forest followed me home. Story number 7. I grew up hearing a lot of stories from my dad about his adventures in the Colorado Rockies back in the late 80s. He wasn't a storyteller in the exaggerated sense. He spoke plainly, like he was describing something that just happened on a Tuesday. That's what made his stories hit harder. There was one particular camping trip he talked about that stuck with me. Not because it had a clear ending, but because it never really did. He and a few of his buddies had set out for a week-long trek through Pikes National Forest one summer. The weather was decent, the kind where the forest feels alive with buzzing insects and the smell of pine sap thick in the air. They'd been hiking for about 3 days when they decided to set up camp in a ravine. It seemed perfect at the time, sheltered from wind, flat ground, a small stream trickling nearby. It gave that false sense of safety that deep woods sometimes do. By nightfall, the forest had turned pitch black in that way only remote places can. No distant highway hum, no cabin lights, just absolute darkness and the creaking sounds of trees shifting in the breeze. My dad said he woke up sometime after midnight to relieve himself. He unzipped the tent carefully so as not to wake the others. The moment the zipper hit the bottom, his flashlight beam cut through the dark, and that's when he saw them. A pair of pale, bare feet standing just outside the tent flap. They weren't his buddies. He knew everyone was inside their sleeping bags. The feet were blotchy, almost like they belonged to someone elderly, with visible veins and patches of darker skin. One foot had a distinct lump right on the right ankle bone, swollen like an old injury. The nails were thick and yellowed. The toes weren't moving. They were just there. He jerked back inside, zipped the tent up in a panic, and his scream woke the others. When they stepped out to check, there was nothing. No footprints in the dirt, no sign of anyone. They walked around flashing their lanterns, calling out. The forest swallowed their voices. My dad stuck to what he saw. He described the feet in detail, even down to which foot had the lump. Tony, one of the guys, went quiet when he heard that detail. He didn't argue or try to laugh it off. He just said they needed to pack up immediately. No explanation. Everyone thought he was overreacting, but something about his tone convinced them. So in the middle of the night, with bugs buzzing and distant owls hooting, they scrambled to move their gear uphill to a higher, flatter spot. The next morning, they woke to find the ravine had turned into a muddy, raging channel overnight. A flash flood had torn through, uprooting saplings and flattening the exact spot they had pitched their tents. It would have swept them all away in their sleep. That part of the story is the one most people remember. But that wasn't the only weird thing that happened on that trip. My dad said the night after they moved camp, something kept pacing outside the new campsite. He described it as soft, shuffling steps, moving in irregular intervals, not the quick scurry of animals. Slower, heavier, almost like someone barefoot was walking in short circles just outside the light's edge. Every time they shone their flashlights, it would stop. The moment they turned them off again, it resumed. None of them slept much. On the third night, my dad woke up to a strange sound. Not footsteps this time, but a kind of hollow tapping. It echoed through the trees, rhythmic but uneven, like someone lightly knocking wood against another surface. It would start faintly from one direction and then appear somewhere else entirely, closer. He thought it might be branches swaying, but it kept changing locations too fast. In the morning, they found a long piece of dead wood leaning against a tree near camp, standing upright at an odd angle. It shouldn't have been able to balance like that. One of the guys knocked it over, thinking it was just wind. But when they came back from their hike later that day, it was upright again. My dad didn't believe in ghosts, not really, but he admitted that something about that forest felt off after the ravine incident. The air had this static quality, like the quiet before a storm, except the weather was clear. Even the birds were unusually silent during certain stretches. The creepiest moment happened 2 days before they hiked back. They had stopped by a clearing to rest and refill their water bottles. It was bright and sunny, around midday. My dad was standing a few feet away from the group when he felt this sudden pressure behind his right ankle, exactly where he'd seen the lump on the mysterious foot that first night. He thought it was a thorn bush or snake, but when he turned around, there was nothing, just open space. When he rolled up his pant leg, there was a faint red handprint on his skin. Not fresh like someone had just grabbed him, but like the outline of a pressure mark, with thin, bony fingers. It faded within an hour, but the guys saw it. No one joked about it. That night was the worst. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet. Even the crickets had stopped. Around 3 a.m., the sound of splashing water echoed from below the hill, like something heavy was moving back and forth in the flooded ravine. It was too rhythmic to be debris, too deliberate. Then came a wet, dragging sound, slowly circling their hilltop, as if something soaked was crawling through the underbrush. My dad said they all just lay still, pretending to be asleep because no one wanted to be the first to unzip their tent again. By sunrise, nothing was out of place. No prints, no wet patches, nothing. They packed up and left that morning without saying much to each other. Years later, when Tony opened up about it, he said his grandfather had died about a month before that trip. One of the last things his grandfather had told him was that he would always watch over him. Tony swore the description of those feet matched his grandfather's exactly. The lump on the right ankle, the blotchy skin. It's why he insisted on moving camp. But that doesn't explain the footsteps, or the wood knocking, or the handprint, or the dragging sounds. My dad always ended the story by saying, maybe it was just his mind playing tricks in a stressful situation. Maybe the flash flood made them hyper-aware of everything afterward. The human brain looks for patterns, especially in the dark. Or maybe it was something else. My dad passed away a few years ago, but before he did, he mentioned something that gave me chills. He said sometimes when he went camping alone in the years that followed, he would wake up in the middle of the night with the same strange pressure behind his right ankle. Never during the day, never when he was awake. Only at night, in the tent. He'd check, and there'd be no mark, nothing there. But he'd feel it, clear as day. He never stopped camping. He just started sleeping with his boots on.